nation stood on the brink of a violent eruption, the tension between two worlds, Catholic and Protestant, rising like a storm cloud. Fear and suspicion held sway, with plots and secrets lurking beneath the polished surface of the English court. In the midst of this turmoil, a group of men quietly plotted to turn the course of history, their deadly aim centred on the very heart of England's power. This was no ordinary conspiracy. It was one that would shake the nation to its core. This is the story of the Gunpowder Plot, a tale of faith, betrayal, and treachery. Welcome to ASMR History Hub, where we delve into the shadows of the past and bring to life the events that shaped our world. Today we turn our attention to one of the most notorious conspiracies in English history, the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. Together we will explore the motives, the men behind the plan, and the devastating impact they hope to unleash. As we gently trace the threads of history, you'll hear the echo of muffled voices plotting in dark corners, feel the weight of the fear that gripped a nation, and witness the unravelling of a dangerous game that almost changed England forever. Our journey begins at a time when England stood divided, fractured by the religious strife that had long plagued the country. The Protestant Reformation had left deep scars, and though Queen Elizabeth II's reign brought a measure of stability, it was an uneasy peace. Her successor, James I, inherited a throne haunted by religious discord. The Catholic minority, yearning for freedom from oppression, had placed their hopes in James, but soon realised that their dream of tolerance would not come to pass. Persecuted, marginalised, and silenced, many Catholics believed they had no choice but to take drastic action. The seeds of rebellion were sown in the fertile soil of desperation and disillusionment. With the crown firmly Protestant and Catholic voices stifled, England became a simmering cauldron of unrest. James I, though less harsh than Elizabeth in some respects, offered little solace to the Catholics. The laws that persecuted them remained, and frustration quickly turned to fury. It was in this atmosphere of distrust and fear that a group of Catholic radicals, led by Robert Catesby, decided that peaceful negotiation was no longer an option. They would fight fire with fire, and their chosen weapon, gunpowder, their plan, to ignite a deadly explosion that would annihilate not just a building, but the entire political order of England. The stakes could not have been higher. As we immerse ourselves in this plot of desperation and intrigue, let's first step back and understand the England in which these men lived, an England ruled by a king whose vision for unity would ultimately drive his subjects to the brink of rebellion. England, under James I, was a nation teetering on the edge of catastrophe, where political manoeuvring and religious persecution fed into a dark and explosive outcome. James I's ascent to the English throne was like the dawning of a new era, one that carried the weight of hope and uncertainty. In 1603, after the long and illustrious reign of Elizabeth I came to an end, England found itself more sympathetic to their plight had arrived. Perhaps, they thought, the days of hiding their faith would come to an end. For many Catholics, the connection to Mary, Queen of Scots, was a symbol of promise. James III, despite being raised Protestant, was seen as a potential ally, someone who might usher in an era of tolerance. After all, his very existence was entwined with Catholic royalty. Yet, as is often the case with new rulers, expectations ran high. The Catholics held on to the belief that James might ease the burden of the brutal penal laws that had cast a long shadow over their lives. These laws, enforced rigorously during Elizabeth's reign, did more than just ban Catholicism. They sought to systematically break the spirit of anyone who dared to worship outside the Protestant Church of England. But as the crown passed from Elizabeth to James, the winds of change that Catholics had so eagerly awaited did not arrive. Instead, they were met with the cold, hard reality that James III, like his predecessor, had little intention of offering them relief. The penal laws, which had torn families apart, seized property, and stripped Catholics of their rights, remained intact. These laws were not just punitive, they were designed to erase Catholicism from the fabric of English society. Catholics were barred from holding public office, excluded from the professions, and often subjected to heavy fines for simply attending a Catholic Mass. The situation was dire. Imagine living in constant fear, forced to worship in secret, knowing that discovery could mean imprisonment, or worse. For Catholics in England, this was their daily reality. The penal laws were not just a set of regulations, they were weapons used to suppress any hope that the Catholic faith could thrive once more in England. While some Catholics quietly submitted, others nurtured a deep, burning resentment. Over time, the restrictions only intensified their anger. The very laws that sought to stamp out their beliefs were, paradoxically, creating the conditions for rebellion. As the fines piled up and the arrests continued, Catholics found themselves pushed further and further into a corner. Their choices grew narrower: endure in silence or take drastic action. But the real betrayal, from the Catholic perspective, was not the continuation of Elizabeth's harsh policies, but James's failure to deliver on his implicit promises. In the early days of his reign, James had sent subtle signals that had given Catholics hope. He appeared to soften his stance on enforcing the laws, and even hinted at the possibility of easing their burdens. Yet, these promises soon withered away, replaced by political pragmatism. James, perhaps wary of upsetting the Protestant establishment that had supported him, swiftly reinforced the status quo. Any hopes Catholics had of reprieve evaporated almost overnight. To them, this was more than a political manoeuvre. It was a betrayal of trust. The disillusionment was palpable, and the once quiet murmurs of discontent grew louder. As the years passed and James consolidated his power, Catholic frustration turned to despair. They had waited, hoped, and prayed, but But James had proven to be just as rigid as Elizabeth. His connection to Mary, Queen of Scots, meant little now. The dream of religious tolerance was fading fast. It was in this atmosphere of despair and frustration that something dangerous began to stir. The Catholic population, already weary of decades of persecution, saw no hope in peaceful negotiation. Their pleas had fallen on deaf ears, as one door after another closed in their faces. A small but determined group of men decided that if change wouldn't come through negotiation, it would come through force. For these men, there was no longer any hope in the established order. They would need to break it, to blow it apart, literally. The idea was simple but deadly. Destroy the king, his government, and the entire Protestant elite in one swift stroke. They would not just end a reign, they would end the regime. This would be no ordinary revolt. It would be a statement, one that would echo throughout history, igniting an explosion, both literal and metaphorical. These men, led by Robert Catesby, would stop at nothing to see their plan through. They were bound together by faith, fury, and an unshakable belief that violence was the only answer left. As we move forward, let us now turn our gaze to these men, the conspirators, and uncover the motivations that drove them to such a drastic and dangerous plan. In the heart of England, a small group of men gathered in secret, bound together by a single, unshakable belief that the Protestant government had to fall. At their head was Robert Catesby, a man whose Catholic faith burned with a zeal so fierce it consumed him. Catesby was no stranger to rebellion. He had witnessed the persecution of his fellow Catholics under Elizabeth I, and like so many, he had hoped for relief when James I took the throne. But the new king had dashed those hopes, leaving Catesby with only one conclusion. Change could not come through diplomacy. It had to come through fire and fury. If England's Catholic population was ever to live freely, the Protestant establishment had to be destroyed, root and branch. Catesby was not the type to shy away from radical action. His plan was simple in concept, but monumental in its ambition. If the government could not be swayed, it would be annihilated. The goal was nothing less than the destruction of the monarchy itself. Catesby envisioned a world where King James I and his Protestant Parliament would be obliterated in one devastating blow, and in the chaos that followed, a Catholic ruler would rise from the ashes. To carry out such an audacious plot, Catesby needed men of action, men who were as committed to the cause as he was. Enter Guy Fawkes, a figure whose name would forever be linked with treason and explosives. Fawkes, a hardened soldier, had spent years fighting for Catholic Spain, honing his skills in warfare and learning the dark art of demolition. His experience made him invaluable to the conspiracy. It was Fawkes who would be tasked with the most dangerous job of all, igniting the gunpowder beneath the House of Lords. The plan called for precision, and Fawkes' steady hand was trusted to carry it out. But Catesby and Fawkes were not alone. Other like-minded men joined their cause, each bringing their own insider status, Percy was key in laying the groundwork for the plot. John Wright, a master swordsman known for his skill and loyalty, was another crucial conspirator. Together with his brother Christopher, John added muscle to the group, ready to defend their cause with cold steel if necessary. Thomas Winter, another of Catesby's trusted confidants, was instrumental in both planning and recruiting. It was Winter who travelled to the continent to seek Spanish support for their cause. Though the mission failed to secure foreign backing, Winter returned undeterred, ready to throw his lot in with Catesby and the others. These men were not mere pawns. They were fully committed to the violent overthrow of the English government. Each of them believed that only through the destruction of the Protestant regime could England be saved from its descent into religious tyranny. The conspirators were united by a single goal: to assassinate King James then and replace him with a Catholic monarch, preferably his young daughter Elizabeth. They believed that by removing James and his government, they could ignite a Catholic uprising that would sweep through England, toppling the Protestant establishment once and for all. The stakes could not have been higher. Failure meant death, not only for them, but for their families and their faith. Success, on the other hand, promised nothing less than the rebirth of a Catholic England. But what drove these men to such lengths? For Robert Catesby, the answer lay in his unrelenting belief that God demanded action. To him, this was not just a political mission, it was a holy crusade. Catesby's faith was the fuel that ignited his fervour, convincing him that the salvation of England's Catholics required bloodshed. He saw himself as an instrument of divine justice, willing to sacrifice his life and the lives of others to achieve what he believed was God's will. For Guy Fawkes, the motivations were more practical, yet no less passionate. His years of service to Catholic Spain had left him with a deep hatred of Protestant England, and he was more than willing to use his expertise in explosives to bring about its downfall. Fawkes was a man driven by a soldier's sense of duty, but also by the conviction that his actions were justified by the atrocities Catholics had endured. The rest of the conspirators shared similar motivations. For Thomas Percy, it was a matter of loyalty to his faith, his family, and the cause of Catholicism. John Wright and his brother Christopher believed that only through violence could justice be achieved. Their swords, sharpened by years of training, would soon be drawn in the service of this deadly plot. Thomas Winter, though perhaps more cautious, ultimately believed that their plan was the only way to force the hand of fate and bring about a Catholic resurgence. As the conspirators swore their oaths of secrecy and began to lay out the details of their plan, they knew that success depended on more than just faith. It required meticulous planning, careful timing, and above all, silence. If word of the plot leaked, it would be over before it even began. Trusting each other with their lives, the men worked in the shadows, gathering gunpowder, securing their positions, and waiting for the right moment to strike. The House of Lords would be packed with dignitaries, wiped out in an instant. The vision was clear, the stakes enormous, and the plan seemingly perfect. But even the best laid plans can unravel in the blink of an eye. As the day of the fateful explosion neared, tensions began to rise. The clock was ticking, and with it came the growing realization that one mistake could lead to disaster. Little did they know, a single letter would set off a chain of events that would unravel everything they had worked for. As the plot edged closer to its fateful execution, let's now explore how their plans unfolded and what went wrong on that fateful November day. November 5th, 1605. A date that was meant to go down in history as the day England's rulers were brought to their knees in a single, devastating act of rebellion. The plan devised by Robert Catesby and his fellow conspirators was breathtakingly audacious. They would detonate 36 barrels of gunpowder beneath the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament, when the King, his ministers, and the Protestant elite would be gathered in one place. In an instant, they would obliterate the English government, plunging the country into chaos, and from the ashes they would rise to restore Catholic rule. It was an all-or-nothing gamble, and they were ready to stake their lives on it. The genius of the plan lay in its simplicity. The conspirators had managed to rent a cellar directly beneath the House of Lords, an unassuming space that was perfect for their needs. By March of 1605, barrels of gunpowder had been quietly transported into the cellar, hidden beneath firewood and coal to avoid suspicion. 36 barrels in all, enough to blow the heart of the English government to pieces, killing everyone inside. Guy Fawkes, with his knowledge of explosives from years of fighting for Catholic Spain, was entrusted with this critical element of the plan. It would be his hand that lit the fuse. For months the group worked in secrecy, gathering materials, making contacts, and biding their time. The countdown had begun, but with a plot of this scale, secrecy was both their greatest weapon and their greatest enemy. The closer they came to the appointed day, the heavier the weight of tension became. Catesby knew the risk of betrayal increased with every passing hour. As their numbers grew, more men had joined the conspiracy to help with the logistics and eventual uprising. It became harder to keep the details contained. Whispers of doubt began to circulate within the group. Some questioned whether such a violent act was truly the right path, while others worried that they had already been discovered. Yet Catesby and Fawkes pushed forward, determined to see their plan through to the bitter end. As autumn turned to winter, the pressure on the conspirators mounted. They were so close, and yet, as the moment of truth approached, it was impossible to shake the fear of discovery. Betrayal, they knew, could come from anywhere. What if one of them faltered? What if the government had caught wind of their activities? Every step outside felt dangerous. Every meeting carried the weight of suspicion. Each man had to look into the eyes of his fellow conspirators and hope, pray, that he had chosen to place his trust in the right people. Catesby's resolve, however, was unbreakable. He believed with every fibre of his being that their mission was divinely sanctioned, that they were the instruments of God's will, destined to restore the Catholic faith to a country that had strayed too far. For him, there could be no turning back. The stakes were too high, and the dream of a Catholic England was worth any sacrifice. But not all of the men shared his unshakable faith. Doubts crept in, the fear of death ever present in their minds, yet none dared voice them aloud. Once you had sworn an oath to this conspiracy, there was no escape. By late October, the pieces were all in place. The gunpowder lay dormant beneath Parliament, ready to unleash its devastating power. Fawkes had carefully checked and rechecked the barrels, ensuring that everything was in order. He would remain in London to oversee the detonation, while Catesby and the others prepared to trigger the uprising that would follow the king's assassination. The conspirators were confident that in the ensuing chaos they could seize control of the country and install a Catholic monarch. It was a plan built on both precision and faith. Faith that everything would go according to plan, and that the flames of revolution would sweep across the land. But as the day of reckoning drew nearer, the burden of secrecy became unbearable. The group's tight-lipped silence began to crack. Catesby could feel it, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. The closer they came to November 5th, the more he noticed the restless glances between his fellow conspirators, the quiet moments of hesitation. They were all in too deep now, but that did little to calm their nerves. After all, this was no ordinary crime. This was regicide, an act so monumental its failure would result in nothing short of their total annihilation. Even Fawkes, calm and composed, could not ignore the growing anxiety among the group. His focus was on the explosives, but the weight of the plot sat heavily on his shoulders. His task was simple but crucial. Light the fuse and slip away before the explosion rocked the very foundations of English power. But even he, a battle-hardened soldier, could not escape the gnawing feeling that something was about to go wrong. As the final preparations were being made, the conspirators began to hear whispers, murmurs that someone might have revealed their plan. In a plot so delicate, where timing was everything, even the slightest leak could spell disaster. They had no way of knowing whether it was paranoia or a real threat, but they couldn't afford to be careless now. Yet, despite these ominous signs, Catesby pushed forward. The powder was set, the fuse was ready, and November 5th was fast approaching. The only thing left to do was wait for Parliament to gather, for the King and his court to walk into the building above the barrels of destruction, and for Fawkes to light the match. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Their secrecy, so carefully maintained for months, would soon unravel in the most unexpected of ways. One of their own, whether driven by guilt, fear, or loyalty to a friend, had decided to warn Lord Monteagle possession. It was a warning meant to save lives, but it would also set in motion the collapse of everything Catesby and his men had worked for. As the conspirators waited in the shadows, preparing to strike, the letter found its way into the hands of the authorities. It was not long before suspicion turned to action. The wheels of government, slow to move at first, began to grind into motion, setting the stage for the dramatic unravelling of the plot. What had begun as a tightly woven conspiracy was about to be torn apart by a single note, a betrayal that none of them could have anticipated. As the fateful letter reached its destination, the government's forces began to stir. Let us now turn to the moment of discovery, the Monteagle letter, and see how the plot unravelled just as it was poised to succeed. On the evening of October the 26th, 1605, a letter arrived at the home of Lord Monteagle. Its contents were brief but alarming, written with a cryptic urgency that left no room for doubt. "My lord," it began, "out of the love I bear to some of your friends, I have care of your preservation. Therefore, I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this Parliament." The message was clear. Monteagle's life was in danger. The author of the letter, though anonymous, seemed desperate to protect him from some unnamed catastrophe set to unfold at the upcoming state opening of Parliament. To Monteagle, the letter was both puzzling and deeply unsettling. Who had sent it? What could it mean? Yet its tone was unmistakable, a warning of imminent peril. Unsure of what to do, Monteagle did the only thing he could think of. He took the letter straight to the authorities. The stakes were too high to ignore such a cryptic message, especially in a time when political plots and intrigue lurked in the shadows of English life. Monteagle's decision to reveal the letter would set in motion a series of events that unravelled a plot of unimaginable treachery. At first, the government's response was one of caution. The letter, though alarming, was vague. It hinted at danger, but provided no concrete details. King James I, however, upon reviewing the note, grew suspicious. His mind turned to the possibility of an explosion, recalling past attempts on monarchs' lives. Orders were quickly issued to search the cellars beneath Parliament, just in case. What they found was nothing short of shocking. As the night of November 4th turned into the early hours of November 5th, Sir Thomas Knivet, tasked with leading the search, descended into the cellar below the House of Lords. By candlelight, his men moved carefully through the cold, damp space. At first there was nothing unusual to see, just stacks of firewood and coal, but behind them, concealed beneath layers of these everyday items, lay something far more dangerous. 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough to obliterate the entire building and everyone inside it. But it was not just the gunpowder that they found. Standing watch over the deadly cache was Guy Fawkes, a man whose name would become infamous. Dressed in a cloak and boots, with a slow-burning fuse at the ready, Fawkes had been left to guard the barrels. spread quickly, and the search for Fawkes' co-conspirators began immediately. As the authorities pieced together the details of the plot, the enormity of what had nearly taken place became apparent. Had the barrels been ignited as planned, it would have decimated the English government in one catastrophic blast. King James, his ministers, and the Protestant elite would have been killed in an instant, and England thrown into chaos. For Fawkes, the hours after his capture were brutal. Taken to the Tower of London, he was subjected to torture in an effort to extract the names of his fellow conspirators. At first he held firm, revealing nothing of the plot or the men who had orchestrated it, but even Fawkes' iron will could not withstand the excruciating pain for long. Under torture, he eventually confessed, naming Robert Catesby as the mastermind behind the conspiracy. With this admission, the full scope of the Gunpowder Plot began to emerge. The authorities now knew they were dealing with a carefully planned conspiracy, orchestrated by a group of radical Catholics who had intended to overthrow the Protestant government. As Fawkes languished in his cell, the hunt for Catesby and the other conspirators intensified. But even as the noose tightened around them, Catesby and his men remained on the run, desperately clinging to the hope that they could still evade capture. The discovery of the Monteagle letter had set off a chain reaction, a slow but steady unravelling of a plot that had been months in the making. What had begun as a carefully guarded secret, known only to a few, was now exposed for all the world to see. The conspirators had come dangerously close to success, closer than anyone could have imagined. But fate, in the form of a single anonymous letter, had intervened. Their carefully laid plans were now in ruins, their dreams of a Catholic revolution extinguished before the first spark could even touch the fuse. But the discovery of the plot was only the beginning of the end. As the authorities tracked down the remaining conspirators, the full force of royal justice would soon be unleashed. What followed would be a reckoning, swift, brutal, and merciless. The men who had sought to bring down the crown would soon find themselves on trial for their lives. For them, there would be no escape, no last-minute reprieve. The plot had been uncovered, but its consequences were only just beginning. Now, let us turn to the aftermath of this infamous conspiracy, to the trials and executions that followed, where the remaining conspirators would face the ultimate punishment for their treason. The aftermath of the Gunpowder Plot was as brutal as the conspiracy itself had been audacious. Guy Fawkes, the man found guarding the barrels of gunpowder, was the first to face the full weight of the Crown's wrath. Taken to the Tower of London, he was subjected to days of excruciating torture. King James I himself had given the order for Fawkes to be interrogated by any means necessary, with the rack awaiting him. At first, Fawkes displayed remarkable resilience, refusing to betray his fellow conspirators. But even the strongest will can be broken. After enduring unimaginable pain, Fawkes finally his confession, the full scope of the Gunpowder Plot began to take shape. As Fawkes languished in his cell, the government wasted no time hunting down the other conspirators. Robert Catesby, the mastermind behind the plot, refused to be taken alive. With a small group of loyal followers, he fled north, hoping to evade capture. But the authorities were relentless. Cornered at Aldbedge House, Catesby and his men prepared for a final stand. What followed was a brief but intense skirmish. Catesby, refusing to surrender, was shot and killed, his dream of a Catholic England dying with him. His body, along with those of his fellow conspirators, was later exhumed and beheaded, the severed heads displayed as a warning to any who might consider following in their footsteps. Not all the conspirators met their end in battle. Some, like Thomas Winter and Robert Keyes, were captured alive. Their fate, however, was no less grim. Brought to London in chains, they would face the full force of English justice. The trial of the surviving conspirators was nothing more than a formality. Their guilt was already sealed. On January 27th, 1606, they were brought before the court, charged with high treason. The sentence was as brutal as it was inevitable. Each man was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most horrific punishment reserved for traitors. The executions were staged as public spectacles, designed to send a clear message to any who dared plot against the crown. Onlookers gathered to watch as the condemned men were hanged until near death, then cut down and disemboweled while still alive. Their bodies were quartered and their remains displayed in prominent locations across the city as a grisly reminder of the consequences of treason. Guy Fawkes, who had played such a central role in the conspiracy, was saved for last. On January 31st, 1606, he was led to the gallows. Fawkes, though broken, managed one final act of defiance. He leaped from the scaffold, breaking his neck and avoiding the full horror of his sentence. Yet, even in death, his body was mutilated, his remains scattered as a symbol of the crown's vengeance. The punishment meted out to the conspirators was designed to crush any future rebellion, but it also served as a stark reminder of how close they had come to success. England, had the barrels been ignited, would have been plunged into chaos, its government obliterated in a single, fiery instant. The thought haunted those who witnessed the trials and executions. The king, his court, and the entire Protestant establishment had been saved by a single letter. The plot had failed, but its legacy was just beginning. As the smoke of the executions cleared, the government moved quickly to tighten its grip on the country. Anti-Catholic sentiment, already strong, grew fiercer. Laws against Catholics were not just enforced, they were expanded. Catholics were now forbidden to practice law, serve in the military, or even vote. The Gunpowder Plot, rather than inspiring rebellion, had cemented Protestant dominance in England. The fear of another Catholic uprising lingered, shaping policies for decades to come. But the legacy of the Gunpowder Plot extended far beyond politics. It became a part of England's cultural memory, a symbol of treason, betrayal, and divine intervention. The failed conspiracy was immortalised in the annual celebration of Guy Fawkes Night, November 5, where bonfires were lit, effigies of Fawkes were burned, and fireworks filled the skies. The plot, though terrifying in its intent, had been transformed into a public spectacle, a yearly reminder of the Crown's triumph over its enemies. Remember, remember, the 5th of November became a chant that echoed through the ages, its meaning evolving as the centuries passed. But what does it truly mean to remember the Gunpowder Plot? As we reflect on the trials and executions, the bloodshed and the brutality, we must also consider the deeper legacy it left behind. The Gunpowder Plot was not just a failed conspiracy, it was a turning point in English history. It marked the end of any hope for a Catholic restoration and the beginning of a new era of religious and political division. The conspirators had sought to change England forever, and in a way, they succeeded. As we now turn to examine the legacy of the Gunpowder Plot, let's explore how this dark chapter in history continued to shape the country's identity for generations to come. The legacy of the Gunpowder Plot extends far beyond the smoke and fire of its failed execution. In the immediate aftermath, England was left reeling from the near catastrophe, and the public's reaction was swift and fierce. The discovery that a group of Catholics had plotted to destroy the very heart of the government ignited a wave of anti-Catholic sentiment that spread like wildfire. For a nation already suspicious of its Catholic minority, the Gunpowder Plot became the ultimate proof of their fears. Catholics, once seen as a persecuted religious minority, were now painted as potential traitors, lurking in the shadows, ready to strike at the Protestant establishment. The failure of the plot solidified the public's perception of Catholics as dangerous conspirators, and this led to a harsh crackdown on the Catholic community. Parliament seized the moment, passing even stricter laws designed to marginalise Catholics further. They were excluded from professions, forbidden from holding public office, and barred from voting. For many, the Gunpowder Plot was a justification for these measures, a necessary step to protect the nation from the threat of religious rebellion. Catholics, already living on the fringes of English society, now faced increased surveillance and persecution. The idea of a Catholic monarch, once entertained in hopeful whispers, became a distant dream, crushed beneath the weight of public fear and government policy. But perhaps the most lasting and visible legacy of the Gunpowder Plot is the annual celebration of Guy Fawkes Day. Every year, on the night of November 5th, bonfires blaze across England and fireworks light up the sky, marking the anniversary of the plot's failure. What began as a celebration of Protestant survival and royal loyalty has, over time, evolved into a broader the centuries following the plot, effigies of Guy Fawkes, sometimes referred to simply as the Guy, have been burned in towns and cities across the country, a ritual meant to symbolise the triumph of law and order over treachery and deceit. The tradition of Guy Fawkes Day, or Bonfire Night as it's sometimes called, has its roots in the very first celebrations held in the days immediately following the foiling of the plot. In 1606, Parliament passed the observance of the 5th of November Act, which made the anniversary of the plot an official day of Thanksgiving. Communities gathered around towering bonfires, and fireworks exploded in the night sky, mimicking the fiery destruction that had been narrowly avoided. Over time, these gatherings became more festive, with children crafting guys out of old clothes and stuffing them with straw to throw onto the flames. Though the religious fervour that once fueled the celebrations has long since faded, the night remains a symbol of England's brush with disaster and its survival. Yet, like so much of history, the meaning of Guy Fawkes Day has shifted with time. What was once a purely patriotic celebration has transformed into something more complex. In modern times, the figure of Guy Fawkes has come to represent not just a failed traitor, but a symbol of rebellion against oppression. This reinterpretation was most famously captured in Alan Moore's graphic novel V for Vendetta, in which the masked figure of Guy Fawkes leads a dystopian society in revolution against a totalitarian regime. The iconic mask from the novel, which has since been immortalised in film and worn by activists around the world, has transformed Fawkes into a symbol of defiance against tyranny, far removed from the original plot's religious motivations. Today, the Guy Fawkes mask is as likely to be seen in protests and demonstrations as it is on the bonfires of November 5th. It has become an enduring emblem of resistance, adopted by movements ranging from the anti-government protests of Anonymous to the Occupy Wall Street movement. In this way, the legacy of the Gunpowder Plot has taken on a life of its own, reshaped by each new generation to fit its own struggles against authority. What was once a failed act of treason has become a symbol of rebellion in its own right, reminding us of the thin line between traitor and freedom fighter. The Gunpowder Plot has also found its way into literature, film and television, where it is often reimagined and romanticised. Writers and filmmakers have used the plot as a backdrop for tales of intrigue, espionage and conspiracy, turning the conspirators into tragic figures whose desperate actions stem from a belief in a greater cause. In this light, the plot is often seen not as a simple act of terror, but as a failed revolution, a misguided attempt to bring about change in a world resistant to it. The figure of Guy Fawkes, with his brooding presence and deadly intentions, has become a captivating anti-hero, a man whose name is forever tied to a moment in history when the fate of a nation hung in the balance. But beyond the bonfire asks, the true legacy of the Gunpowder Plot lies in its impact on the relationship between faith and politics in England. The plot marked the beginning of a long period of suspicion and hostility between Catholics and Protestants, a divide that would shape English society for generations to come. It also served as a reminder of the dangers of extremism, both religious and political, and the lengths to which people will go when they believe they have no other options. The Gunpowder Plot was not just a failed assassination, it was a desperate cry for change, a testament to the power of belief, and a warning of the destructive potential of unchecked fanaticism. As we reflect on the legacy of the Gunpowder Plot, we must remember that its echoes can still be heard today in the celebrations of Bonfire Night, in the symbols of protest, and in the continuing debates over the balance between religion and politics. The plot may have failed, but its impact endures, reminding us of the fragile nature of power and the enduring struggle for freedom. Now, as we approach the conclusion of our journey through this infamous conspiracy, let us consider how history has judged the Gunpowder Plot and what lessons we can take from this dark chapter in England's past. The Gunpowder Plot stands as one of the most infamous conspiracies in English history, a moment when the fate of a nation teetered on the edge of destruction. Though it ultimately failed, the plot's impact reverberated far beyond the events of November 1605. It exposed the deep religious divides that tore at the fabric of England and left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of the nation. What began as a desperate act of defiance became a symbol of the tension between authority and rebellion, faith and politics, oppression and resistance. In the years since, the Gunpowder Plot has been both condemned and reimagined. Guy Fawkes, once reviled as a traitor, has evolved into a symbol of resistance against tyranny. Each year, as bonfires blaze and fireworks crackle in the night sky, the story of the plot is retold, its legacy passed down through generations. But beyond the spectacle of Guy Fawkes' night, the plot serves as a powerful reminder of how fragile power can be and how the desperation of a few can threaten the stability of an entire kingdom. As we reflect on the events of that fateful year, it's clear that the Gunpowder Plot was more than just an act of treason. It was an expression of the enduring struggle for religious freedom, a fight against a system that had silenced and persecuted Catholics for too long. Though their methods were violent, the conspirators believed they had no other choice. Their actions were a product of the turbulent times they lived in, a time when faith and politics were inextricably intertwined, and the future of England seemed uncertain. In the end, the Gunpowder Plot failed to achieve its aim, but its legacy continues to shape how we view rebellion, faith, and power. It is a story of high stakes and greater consequences, of individuals willing to risk everything for what they believed in, whether for good or ill. History, after all, is often shaped by such moments, where the line between hero and villain is blurred, and where the outcome of a single event can change the course of a nation. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most dramatic conspiracies. If you found this exploration of the Gunpowder Plot intriguing, I invite you to subscribe to ASMR History Hub, where we uncover more stories from the past, whispering the secrets of history in ways both soothing and captivating. There are countless tales yet to be told, and I look forward to sharing them with you.